I'm Mr. Dan D'Amico. I'm the faculty advisor for Econ Club. Just want to make a few brief announcements before our presentation today. If you've never been to Econ Club before, this is pretty much typical. Lunch is always served. Show up about 15 minutes early, get your plate full, find a seat, etc. Meetings tend to fill up, so those of you in the back, come earlier next time. Two brief announcements. First is that on the screen what you can see is our Facebook group. So if you're wanting to be kept up to date on upcoming meetings, having ability to communicate with other club members, etc., you should definitely like the page, subscribe to the page on Facebook, etc. A number of the upperclassmen are accessible for things like tutoring and study assistance through the Economics Club, so using the website, the Facebook page, it's a great way to get in touch with them. The current two major officers are Pat Testa, our president-elect, and Pedro, our resident webmaster tech guru person. Other announcements, there's a number of free literature here up at the front provided by National Organization Students for Liberty, which is going to be hosting one of our events later this semester, a weekend conference that is free, it'll be fun. So on your way out, feel free to grab some free books. One other event. Feel free to help yourself to seconds during the lecture. And I wanted to say one more thing. Organizational meeting will be Tuesday during the window in this room again. So if you are wanting to be more involved with the Economics Club, aside from just attending lectures, but actually have ideas for topics, or last semester we did a number of film events and group discussions and sort of roundtable debates amongst students, etc. We're going to be filling in the remaining dates of the semester and sort of planning additional events aside from just outside lecturers at this organizational meeting on Tuesday. The school student organizational fair is on Thursday, a week from today, and so we're going to need students to sort of man the table, so reach out to the masses, explain what Econ Club is all about, etc. So if you want to be a part of that, please attend on Tuesday, this room, same time, same place, but on Tuesday. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Zach Caceres, who's our lecturer today. Hailing from Guatemala City, currently at the University of Francisco Marroquín. Zach's sector is called the Free Cities Institute, Startup Cities Institute. So we're going to hear about what that means, what free cities are, what startup cities are, how it is that the relationship between business entrepreneurship and urban development really overlap. So, Zach.
So hi, like Dan said, my name is Zach, and I was remarking earlier that I can't believe how many people are in the club here. It's like when I was in an undergrad that long ago, and I was lucky if 5 people were interested enough in econ to come and talk about it. So it's pretty incredible. I run an organization in Loyola City called the Startup Cities Institute. It's a nonprofit research organization that studies the possibilities of what we call startup jurisdictions for political or legal reform. And it's a bit of a mouthful, and the rest of it I'll say is we'll be talking about what that means and what we believe it could potentially do for people. Well, to start out with, probably we'll start with a story. Some of you probably know about a guy named Muhammad Buazizi. I don't know, maybe. How much economics have you guys had, actually? Is it a mix? It's a mix. Some of you have had a lot, some of you have had a little. Okay. So Muhammad Buazizi was 26 years old. He was a fruit vendor in rural Tunisia. And he, every single day, got up in the morning, packed up a cart full of fruit, hauled it to town, and spent the day selling it to people in the street. Now what he was doing was basically what was illegal. He didn't have licenses, he didn't have the permits necessary to sell fruit in the street. And so municipal authorities, every chance they got, would crack down on Muhammad Buazizi. What they would do is they would steal his fruit, they would confiscate the scales, they would steal his cart, they would all of these things because he didn't have licenses. The problem is that the licenses cost more than he would make in a year. So he was caught in this very vicious thing where on one hand he needed licenses to make a living, and on the other hand he couldn't get them because it was almost impossible. Every time they would take his things, his fruit, they would put it in impound, he would have to pay a big fee to get it out, and this constant drain on his savings prevented him from ever expanding, from fulfilling very simple kinds of dreams like buying a truck so that he didn't have to haul by hand all of his goods every single day. Now, one day, a few years ago, Buazizi, the same thing happened. They came, they took all of this stuff, they spat on him, he was beaten by the police, and he went to City Hall and decided he wanted to protest, to make a call of grievance against them and ask for some help. And they turned him away. They basically said, this is not our problem, this is your problem. So Muhammad Buazizi went outside and he doused himself in paint thinner and he committed suicide by self-immolation, by lighting himself on fire. And after he killed himself, it's a very jarring thing, right? After he killed himself, there were huge protests in Tunisia. He became the sort of poster child for what eventually became the pro-democracy movements that turned into the Arab Spring. So he, more or less, his violent death, his suicide, was the spark that lit off the powder keg that's still going on in the Middle East. The problem is, I think, is that a lot of people look at Bouazizi's story and they draw weird conclusions, at least conclusions that to me seem weird and misplaced. So, what happened here? I think one thing is to look at it like an economist and understand, well, there were restraints on his trade, and his wages were low, and he faced all these institutional barriers to bettering himself and all of this. But I don't think that captures the whole story. I think there's also a psychological story here, which is that Bouazizi's life had been rendered so completely unlivable, so entirely impossible for him to continue with, that he preferred to die than to continue to live the life that was available to him in Tunisia. So, a lot of economists, a lot of people talk about inequality, right? I'm sure you probably, in econ class, you might talk about the Gini coefficient, or everyone's always yelling about raising the minimum wage or lowering the minimum wage, or all of these kinds of things. But I want to talk about a very different kind of inequality that I think Bouazizi's story is evidence of, and that's inequality in access to law and governance. And it's an inequality that most people do not talk about. It's not a mainstream conversation. It's not one that most people are even willing to acknowledge exists. But in my opinion, it's one that is extremely, extremely important. I think probably much more important than income inequality, which people focus on, because I think income inequality stems from this to a large extent, especially the kind of income inequality that people don't like. So, there's an index called the Doing Business Index. Some of you probably, maybe you've seen it before. It's made by the World Bank. All it does is they look and they see what are the obstacles someone faces to doing business in their country. Then they make all these indices and then they rank everyone. So all countries are ranked from top to bottom. This is called the ease of doing business. And if you look at the ease of doing business, it tracks the wealth and even the reported happiness levels of nations very, very closely. Areas where it's easy to do business are richer, they're happier, they're healthier, they have higher literacy rates, they have lower rates of violence, it tracks most indicators of human well-being very, very, very well. So what's going on in the developing world in the Doing Business Index? Most developing countries, it is essentially impossible. It's basically impossible for a poor person to start a business. And I don't mean the poor person is stupid, I don't mean they don't have a good idea, I don't mean they don't have money. I mean the law makes it as such that it is practically impossible for a poor person to start a formal business. And let me give you a good example from Zimbabwe. I just took these from this year's Doing Business Index. Zimbabwe is a very poor and very unhappy country. If you look at where they are in the Doing Business Index, currently it takes 614 days to get a permit if you wanted to build a shop. And if the wait isn't long enough, it costs $28,310. Now, to an American, saving up $28,000 may actually be a feasible goal, so it may not sound that much. But if you put it in the context of what the income in Zimbabwe is, it's 6,154% of income per capita. What that means is that if we put it in terms of what that would be in America, it would be if you wanted to open a shop, and to open the shop, you needed $1,764,000 just to get a permit to build the thing. So, what does that mean? It means no poor person in Zimbabwe is going to be able to do that. It's a total fantasy. It's a delusion to believe that that's a real option for someone who's poor in a country like this. So what happens is you get something called the informal economy. It's the informal economy are all of the people who have been, by law and by politics, excluded from the legal economy. These are people, maybe some of you have traveled in developing countries, these are people who are selling you pirated DVDs at gas stations, or they're selling you like some bag of carrots at some speed bump, or they're trying to shine your shoes while you're in the mall. People are hustlers, basically. They're hustlers, and there are billions and billions of these hustlers all around the developing world. I mean hustlers not in any derogatory sense. I mean they're simply trying to do anything they possibly can to make a living. And they're doing that because the legal economy is totally closed off. And it's closed off because of the legal barriers that I just described. Another one is, in Zimbabwe, if I made a contract with you and you broke the contract, to sue you and get my money back costs more than the money I would get as a result of the legal claim. So I lose money to enforce a contract in Zimbabwe. It's completely backwards. Now, you might think that the informal economy is a small phenomenon, or it's a phenomenon that's reserved mostly for the developing world, but it's not. In fact, the majority of the world's population actually works in the informal economy. As of about 7 to 10 years ago, more than 50% of all of the people on Earth are no longer in the legal economy of the nations in which they live. That's kind of a big deal. It means that when you look at some map and you see the economy of Ghana, or you see the economy of Mexico, and you think, oh, here it is, like here's the government and the economy's underneath there. It's not true. It's not true. And if you go to these places, you really see it. You see there are two parallel systems, one of which is the formal legal economy, regulated, controlled, using the legal system of the government, and another entirely parallel economy that's a black, gray market economy that employs the vast majority of the people. And in the case of Zimbabwe, the informal economy provides 95% of the employment in the nation. So I think it's only reasonable to say in this case, the informal economy is the economy at that point. It's the national economy, if it's employing only 5% of the people. Is that really the national economy? It's not clear, I think, that it is. So, you have what I think to be a very serious humanitarian issue, and one for economists that they ought to pay attention to. It's a messy issue in the sense that it's not very, you can't just sort of cleanly do some statistical analysis. You have to really go look at what's going on down on the ground. But it's one that I think is only going to get bigger and more serious the longer that it takes. Because as you can see with things like the Arab Spring, there are a lot of people who are very, very, very angry at their governments and the way that their governments treat them, and the lives that they're offered in their national systems. And a lot of that is because of informality. It's because economic opportunity is being systematically kept from the vast majority of people around the world because of the way the law works. So you might think, right, that if the law is a problem, right, then there have been countries that have reformed pretty well, and you can move up the Doing Business Index. And when they move up the Doing Business Index, they tend to have less chance of civil war, less youth violence, less youth unemployment, higher GDP, all of the things that economists like, right? You might think, well, why don't we just reform, right? It's like, it's so easy, it's so obvious. Well, why should it cost $30,000 to get a permit? Why can't some dude somewhere in Zimbabwe just be like, okay, it doesn't cost $30,000 anymore, like problem solved? And the answer is because the formal economy and the people who thrive in the informal economy and the political system itself thrives and benefits upon the existence of these parallel systems. What I mean by that is the systematic exclusion that goes on towards the general population benefits political and economic elites. And explain that in more detail. If everyone can compete against you, you stand a lot higher chance of having your business get challenged, to go out of business. It's a much harder road. But if I can get in a position where I have, in effect, a monopoly over industries, I don't have to worry about you. You all have to buy what I'm building, and I don't care. I don't have to provide you with good service. I don't have to provide you with good prices. I don't have to be careful with costs. I don't really have to care. And I'm sure you learned from, in econ class, the way that monopolies in industry, they tend to systematically abuse their customers. And it's a similar kind of thing, but it's done in a way that encompasses almost the entire national economy. So the big problem that you face with reform is that the same people who have the ability to fix the problem, the same people who could say, okay, it doesn't cost all this money to go and start a business anymore, are the same people who benefit from it costing so much to start a business. It's a very, very vicious thing when you get down to it. Because the very people who have economic and political power in a given developing country are the same people who benefit from all the monopolies that the legal system creates. So the people you have to convince to change the way things are the very people who would have to give up privilege and money and power and success and connection and control to allow it to happen. And we're on the wrong side of the Garden of Eden to believe that people are just going to do this out of the goodwill of their heart, right? So if we're caught in this catch-22, if we're caught in this vicious cycle, if national reform means it runs up against this brick wall, it runs up against this brick wall of elites who are unwilling to reform because they would have to give up benefits to themselves to reform, what do we do? How do countries ever get out? How has any country ever gotten out of this vicious cycle? And one plausible answer is crazy things happen. And it might not sound like a very compelling answer, but basically what it means is that sometimes you have very extreme situations, for instance, war, or a natural disaster, or a crazy political upheaval, something like this, and it shuffles the pot around so much that there's an opportunity for reform. Some of you may know this book, The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. It's a very, very famous book. Generally, the argument is that bad people go and they force market reforms on countries in moments of crisis. It's called the shock doctrine, like electroshock therapy is sort of the analogy she's using. But it's not always clear that electroshock therapy is bad, even if it's coming out of a really bad situation. There can be, for example, one example that I learned being here in New Orleans is that a lot of people think that schools post-Katrina in New Orleans are better now than they were before Katrina. And of course, Katrina was a terrible disaster. In no way is it a justification or is it a good thing that happened or anything like that. But when these kinds of really big, shocking, big events happen, they have the potential to break these ties and to break and sever the control that political and economic elites have over a system, and it opens up opportunities for reform to occur. But of course, no one wants that to happen. No one says like, "Oh God, if only we could reform. I wish there were a giant hurricane. I wish there were an absolutely exhaustive bombing campaign that would destroy everything, and then we could reform." That would be terrible, and no one wants that. So but again, you're caught in this catch-22, right? Where the status quo is really bad and really hard to get out of using traditional political means, like sending a petition to the governor, because the governor is beholden to special interests. The special interests benefit from the monopolies, and you want them to get rid of the monopolies that the special interests benefit from, therefore it's just not going to happen. But then the only way to get out of it is when this bad stuff happens. So it's not a very when you think of it this way, it can really make a person pessimistic. It can really make a person feel very bad for the future that developing countries have. By the way, I think arguably this is a reason why developing countries have had such a hard time, and why foreign aid hasn't really done all that we've hoped it would do. A lot of developing projects pushed through the government have not really done the things that people hoped they would do. There's been a continuous kind of struggle against moving up this index, basically, allowing actual market reform to occur. So what do we do? What do we do when we're faced with something like this? Is there anything? Is it totally hopeless? I don't think so. I don't think it's totally hopeless, but I think the strategy that people use has to be significantly different. Essentially, you have to find a way to get over these special interest problems and create systematic reform in a national government, but not through the national government. Because the national government is sort of the problem. So you're expected to use the problem to solve the problem, but it's not that easy, right? So this is where this idea called startup cities came from. The website startupcities.org, if you're interested later. Essentially, what startup cities are is they're the creation of very small jurisdictions, like a community-sized jurisdiction, with a high degree of autonomy that allows them to pilot political and economic reforms. In other words, instead of reforming the whole country, instead of saying, okay, tomorrow it's free to start your business in Zimbabwe, because as soon as you start doing that, all the special interests come out, all the politicians come out, they all get together and they prevent it from happening. Instead, you say, okay, here's Zimbabwe. We're never gonna get all this. It's gonna be way too hard. So we say, look, we're just gonna run a little experiment right there. In reality, it's probably more like, a tiny little dot on the map. And you have a municipality, something like New Orleans municipal government, something of that size, that is able to use a significantly different legal system, especially commercial legal system, from the surrounding countries. So instead of Zimbabwean law, we'll call it Z law, they're going to use British common law. Because England, for all its faults and all of its benefits and stuff, it's got pretty good commercial law. It's proven itself over time. So you put a tiny little patch of British common law in Zimbabwe. And then what you do is you say, look, this is not imposed on anyone. This is entirely voluntary. You could practically put it in the middle of the jungle as long as it wasn't totally accessible, but you don't have to go and interfere with anyone's way of life or oppress anyone on the way. And you just simply say, look, now it's up to you. You have a choice. You can continue to use Zimbabwe law, or you can come to this tiny area and take part in British common law. And in British common law, it's not nearly as hard to start a business, right? And it doesn't have to be British common law. You don't need to get bogged down in the details. The basic principle is you can take part in legal and institutional system number 2 rather than legal and institutional system number 1. And essentially this principle is already what happens, right? It's called immigration. Already, say if I were a Mexican immigrant, if I'm on this side of the Rio Grande, and I'm just going to pick, I'll pick the median monthly wage, monthly salary in Honduras, for example, is about $350 US a month. It's not very much money, and you're actually doing pretty well if you're doing that. You're in the comfortable lower middle class, basically. If I cross a magical line in the sand called the US border, you get a good construction job, you could practically make that in a day. What's going on here? Is it magic, or is America just such a superior place that people just magically get rich when they cross the border? No, it's not. It's that America has a much better, first of all, a much more deeply developed economy with more specialization and more exchange going on, but also
it has a much better legal and economic system and a much better opportunities for people to start businesses and get rich starting businesses, and in the process employ tons of people. So you think of here, this is where there are a lot of entrepreneurship is happening, big time formal entrepreneurship in America. This is where a lot of informal entrepreneurship is happening, here in Mexico or in Honduras or in Guatemala. And as soon as people come up here, they find that their life prospects can go up by a factor of 30 or a factor of 50. I mean, it's a world of difference. And this is why people risk life and limb, and they risk they put really their lives on the line every single day to smuggle themselves across the border. It's not, sometimes in immigration debates, you hear people and they act like it's this totally irrational thing, like there are just these droves of people who, for some unknown irrational reason, are putting themselves through this incredibly dangerous process to come to America. And we don't know why. Why are they coming? I wish they wouldn't come. You hear stuff like this. But if I told you, if on this side of the room, you could make 30 times more than if you're on this side of the room, would you cross this line? I would. I would. I don't think it takes rocket scientists, and these people aren't stupid. They're looking for opportunity, and they cross the invisible line. So you're trying to take this immigration dynamic, but putting it within a nation itself, right? Because the reality is, it's really hard. It's really hard for someone from Zimbabwe or even from somewhere a lot closer like Honduras to come to America. People get kidnapped, people get raped, people get sold into slavery. I mean, really, really serious stuff, just because they're trying to cross this invisible line. So, you create the small jurisdiction, and you let people choose. What you do is you give power, you give people the power of exit, right? When we think about democracy, what do we think? We think about raising our democratic voices in opposition to something we don't like, or in favor of some policy that we do like. We use our voice to express what we want out of politics. The problem is that voice is oftentimes extremely, extremely ineffective. My personal opinion is that voice is actually, without exit, voice is almost useless. Because if you think about it, if you can't make a credible threat that says, look, if you don't shape up, I'm leaving, why does anyone care? Well, why would anyone really care about what you're saying? Unless they're nice, and there are nice people, but in this kind of, you don't want your political system and the possibilities of your political system to be banking on the fact that people are really nice, right? So, if people in a country like Zimbabwe can't make any credible threat to leave, they have no other choice, effectively, they face a monopoly in law. And as you probably know from Econ 101, you learn about monopoly, right? There's a systematic exclusion that goes on where monopolies prevent new entrants into the market, and they're able to leverage that position in the market to lower quality, raise prices, engage in all kinds of anti-competitive behaviors that economists, generally speaking, don't really like, right? And I think if you look at, think for a second about the number that we just described about Zimbabwe and how it costs $30,000 to get a permit, right? Why should it cost $30,000? If I could go, right, imagine for a second Zimbabwe was over here and another country was here, and it cost $100 over here to start a business and $30,000 over here. Why would I start a business over here? The only reason I would start a business over here is if I really didn't have any other good option. That's what's happening. And when I mentioned the informal economy, that's the dynamic that's going on, is that you have such dysfunctional formal legal and political systems that people are already exiting the economy to go into these black and gray market trades. And they're selling stuff on the street, and I mean, these people don't pay taxes, they don't, they don't have, their contracts are by word of mouth, and they just go about their business. In fact, it's really incredible what some of these people pull off. I met a guy in Kenya who was shipping, he went to China with $50,000 in cash, and he bought cell phones, like knockoff cell phones, and he had them shipped back to Kenya. And it was in a port, and they were in a box. And on the box, it said John with a phone number. And that was it. That was the whole logistics system. And when it arrived, somebody was supposed to call John, the guy that just put down 50K on all these phones, and he was going to come pick it up and get it to market. But that was an entirely informal arrangement. There were no courts, there was no government, it was just done by a couple people doing stuff under the table. So it's a big economy, and this process of leaving to take part into that economy, as I mentioned, already consumes most of the world's population. So, if you put this little jurisdiction here, what happens? If you do a good job, presumably people will want to come, right? More and more people opt into this jurisdiction, and it starts to grow, right? And maybe it doesn't grow physically, but it grows in density. You know, like Manhattan continues, it grows upward rather than outward, right? Another thing starts to happen is that it begins to put competitive pressure on the national system. So if money, good people, entrepreneurs, ideas, educated people, labor, everything starts exiting this jurisdiction into the smaller jurisdiction, the larger jurisdiction faces a much stronger incentive to reform itself. Because they then start facing the reality that their citizens now don't just have voice, but they have exit, right?
But how do you enforce the jurisdiction of a smaller city in comparison to these politically dominant figures who,
sure.
And rather than reforming their own business strategies, would probably just violently overcome that small incited.
And actually, that's actually, well, let's talk about that, because that's a really good question, and that's usually the first question that people think is, well, isn't that so nice? Like, yeah, if I could, it's sort of like saying, well, if we could fix it, then we could fix it, right? It's just like you're assuming away the hard part, which is that if reform is so hard here, why is it going to be possible to put a reform here? It's the same thing, right? It's the same deal. The difference is, have any of you ever played the video game, or not the video game, the board game Risk? I like Risk. First, because it's, well, I don't like that it always takes 8 hours, but I like how evil all of your friends become when you start playing it. It brings out this Machiavelli, everyone's inner Machiavelli, you know. Divide and conquer, right? It's the ageless strategy that political elites use on the populace, right? You have interest group A, and you have interest group B, and we'll say these are the reds, and these are the yellows, and the guy up here, we'll call him Q for queen, decides, I want more power, I want more control. So what I do is I get all the reds to gang up with me on the yellows, and I take rights and privileges and things away from the yellows. And then when I'm done doing that, I gang up with all the yellows against the reds, and then I take all their, I take power and privilege from them, and every time my power gets aggrandized, and the power in general gets diluted. It's another catch-22 in political economy, right? Because it's very, very hard to organize, to get A and B both together to say we're united against this. It's very easy, however, to divide people and then conquer them one by one, because divided they're much easier to control.
Sure. I also just wonder if maybe what you could do is, let's say there's a given politician who makes some certain rent somehow. You know, he says, you know, I'm the one who gets to, you know, hand out the licenses. You know, my family runs all the businesses. You know, and every year I get $100,000 for this. What if you said, let's say you said, look, I'll start up this startup company. Let's say Coca-Cola has already said they want to start a bottling plant. What if Coca-Cola gives you $500,000 to let us start the startup city? Like, they do something like that?
There is. I think that dynamic occurs without you even having to like go and sit down and talk about how some politician's going to get a kickback. Let me explain what I mean. So if you have this divide and conquer thing, this strategy that's used traditionally against the general populace in politics, I think that startup cities has the potential to redeploy that strategy back against the political system. So rather than the political system dividing and conquering the populace, startup cities create the potential of dividing and conquering the allegiances of political elites and allowing the general population to actually regain freedoms and regain reforms from the political system. Let me say what I mean is that the interests that run the show here, they're not all the same, right? Some guy owns all the cement companies, and some guy owns all the beer, and some guy owns the biggest plantations, and some guy owns this, and some guy owns that. It's heterogeneous, right? They have very different interests all around the country. The problem is, when you reform the whole country, what do? You threaten everybody's interest in the whole deal. You threaten plantation guy, beer guy, cement guy, construction guy, all of these people. But if you reform here, maybe you don't threaten cement guy. Maybe you don't threaten plantation guy who owns this much of the country over here, right? You have the potential where you can actually create a large interest group of both the general populace and political elites, like he mentioned over there, in favor of small-scale reform, or reform in a small area, because the interests of the elites are not aligned. And at that point, you're able to potentially get enough elites on your side to affect reform in a small area that you would never get on your side if you were trying to reform the general system. Sure.
I can see that as like an idea of if you want to tackle school reform or you want to tackle business reform like in the cement industry or something of that sort. But what you're talking about is you're talking about creating an area that basically competes with the entire formal economy or the economy of the system. I mean, doesn't that threaten everyone's interests that you're talking about?
I think it depends how it's structured. Because, first of all, there's this cognitive thing that happens, right? If I'm selling cement to 14 million people, and when this thing starts, if there's 5,000 people, I mean, I'm still the only game in town, in the grand scheme of the national economy. And actually, hold on at that just for a second, and I'll talk about that in just a second, because you're right. In the end, I think it does threaten generally the network of special interests that tends to control national economies. Another thing that happens, which I think you were getting at, is a lot of these, if you hang out in developing countries, it sort of feels like, it's like family dynasties. A lot of businesses are run like family dynasties, where grandpa was like a goat herder, and now he's like a mega industrialist, and he's got a bunch of kids, and a lot of times the kids didn't necessarily have really awesome childhoods, right? And they're looking to make their own mark on their own. They don't want to be tethered to the family dynasty because they've been hearing about cement since childhood, and they're ready to not do cement anymore. So what you potentially do is you actually offer a new frontier to a lower generation of political elites. So the nephew of cement guy goes and starts the cement plant in the new, more competitive area, right? Or he starts a chain of pharmacies in the new area. And at that point, it becomes much more difficult for, like you mentioned over there, or actually like you mentioned, it becomes more difficult for the political system to just engage in a violent seizure of everything. It's totally a possibility, and I'll talk more about that. But it becomes more difficult because the interests start getting more dispersed. And especially over time, if you have exponential growth, suddenly you have a golden goose. And the goose laying the golden egg, right? And if dad is the guy who's going to pull the strings for expropriation, and nephew is also enjoying a lot of economic opportunities and indeed things that look like rents in the new area, then it's not as easy for that kind of violence to occur. I think the most dangerous part is early on, before you have the big network effects. You could think of also a place like Hong Kong. Everyone was really worried that China was going to expropriate Hong Kong right after independence. But they didn't, and they didn't arguably. A lot of people are arguing because so many people in China are doing so well in Hong Kong that everyone's like, don't mess this up. Don't mess this up because we're all getting rich, you know. And it's true that a lot of the people that are getting rich are elites. But a lot of people who are not elites are also getting rich. So you are creating a more generalized kind of progress. Okay, so So maybe another way to think about this is to think about it as in technology, okay? Because everyone's familiar with this, even if you're not familiar with this in the abstract sense. Everyone's familiar with this phenomenon. Okay, it's called the S-curve in technology. What happens is a new technology comes out, and the first people that adopt it are rich nerds. And that's almost always the story with any new technology, because you know, a great example of digital cameras, early digital cameras were like tens of thousands of dollars, and they took really crappy pictures, and they were really huge, and no one wanted them, and no one had that kind of money. So the first people were early adopters. They were nerds, you know, nerds about photography that when they would put out all that money. Problem is that over time, it's no longer just nerds, because that technology starts improving, right? Suddenly, digital cameras are not $10,000, and they're not the size of, you know, a giant computer and all of this. For long, it reaches the point of massification, where suddenly a lot of people are talking about, wow, you know, everyone, I need a digital camera, and did you see her digital camera? It's awesome, and now I'm going to get one. And then before long, it reaches the peak up here, where the new technology becomes the new status quo. Now everyone has a digital camera, and almost nobody. And now film cameras are the niche, like the interesting little niche thing, and digital cameras are the mainstream. And I think you could make an analogous argument for what could potentially go on with something like this. Because early technologies, they start out and they're usually pretty bad. Like I said with cameras. When first digital cameras came out, the new digital cameras were worse than film in every conceivable way, except they offered the ability to not use film. Right? So they had worse quality pictures, more expensive, more clunky. The only thing they offered was you don't have to use film. Problem is, most people didn't care enough about not using film, but a few people did. The rich nerds we were talking about, the early adopters. But over time, right? So actually Kodak used to have hundreds of thousands of employees. It was, I mean, if there was anything that could be considered sort of a market monopoly, they used patents and all of this, but they were a giant firm. And even in some places of the world, camera, the word for camera is just Kodak. Like that's how much power they had over the camera market. And a few companies started making these early digital cameras. Again, they were worse in every way except for this one feature. But they tinker with it over time, and pretty soon the resolution is as good as film. And pretty soon it's as cheap as film. And pretty soon it's as small as film, or maybe even smaller. And at that point, you have all of the same features of the dominant technology, and you have the additional feature that they started out with the niche, which is that you don't have to use film anymore. That's when it crosses this threshold. That's when it becomes a disruptive technology. When you think about what's happened with the internet, when you think about how social networks have operated, for the switch from MySpace to Facebook, right? Everyone was like, wow, MySpace, everyone has a MySpace, it's so great. Facebook wasn't that great at the beginning, but it offered a few small things that were relatively insignificant in the beginning, and now it offers everything MySpace does, plus all of the additional benefits of Facebook, and MySpace is trying to sort of catch up with Facebook, but MySpace is never going to win. It's never going to win because they didn't pay attention here. When all the early adopter nerds were switching over to Facebook, then this happened, and everyone knows because all your friends started saying, oh, I'll just make you one. I'll make you a Facebook, right? And now we're here. And eventually, probably in the next few years, before anyone knows it, there's going to be another one of these, and Facebook is going to be the X. This is a general model, and it's pretty empirically strong for how technologies advance. And I think you can make an analogous argument for what could potentially happen here. Now, ideally, the way we've actually structured the practical reforms that have gone on, because this isn't just on the chalkboard, this is, I live in Guatemala for a reason, which is that Honduras has passed a series of reforms that have, that might make this a reality, and other countries, including Guatemala, are looking at it, and we're trying to be helpful at where we can, and making them responsible and knowledgeable about what's going on. Let's say instead of just one, you had 8, right? 8 tiny jurisdictions, and they're all running different legal systems. and you let people free entry, free exit. You're not oppressing anyone, you're not forcibly relocating anyone, you're just making this available. People begin to choose which jurisdiction they like. And what happens? The people that are going to move are going to be adventurous people. They're going to be the sort of developing world, informal economy equivalent of the rich nerds that went to digital cameras first. They're the early adopters. And the truth is, I think that it might be wrong to paint them as rich nerds in this, because I think a lot of the people are going to actually be the most desperate people in society, will be the first ones to go. And I think this gives this idea a strong argument for humanitarians, because it's basically an escape valve. It's havens for the most desperate people in a given society to go out and try something new. More and more people start going. More and more people start taking advantage of those things. Some of these fail, because that's how startups work. This guy fails, this guy fails, this guy fails, this guy fails. People leave and they can't sustain it anymore. And they all move to these other ones because they're better. Then before long, you have the massification of this phenomenon, where not only could you have still new ones opening, but you have a larger and larger proportion of the population opting in to these alternative arrangements. And at that point, it functions quite similarly to a traditional technology, in the sense that at that point, you have significantly disrupted the social operating system of the national economy. And by disruption, I don't mean something bloody or something bad or something. I simply mean in the way that the internet has disrupted everything. Things are no longer the same because we have the internet, right? And it's reverberated through everything. A similar idea, but done on the level of law and governance. So, to get to to sort of round back to the question of inequality that we talked about at the beginning, is most people are focused on income inequality, right? I think income inequality, and a lot of the things that people don't like about income inequality, is a function of inequality in access to law and governance. Because, first of all, there's always going to be people who just for luck or for happenstance end up with a more successful business than others. There's no way to get rid of that so long as you have innovation. So that kind of inequality will never be able to be fixed, I don't think. I don't think that should make us too uncomfortable, though, because that process pulls up the bottom of the economic pyramid very, very quickly. And if you can create a lot of open access to law and governance, to good systems in law and governance, you allow for even the poorest members of society to access good quality law and governance, which currently in most developing countries only elites have access to. So in this regard, it's actually a process, almost you might say democratization. People like this word, right? They talk about such and such has democratized design, or has democratized photography, or has democratized movie making, or has whatever, democratized journalism. You know, people talk about this a lot. That's great. All those things are awesome. But the fact of the matter is, if you can democratize law and governance, you can have a much more meaningful impact. Because if you democratize law and governance, you stir the pot, you give people very significant opportunities to better themselves and to lead better, healthier, happier, more humane, more dignified lives that are appropriate to them, and you create a massive amount of economic progress in the process, and you increase their incomes at the same time, right? Which is what happens here, right? So income inequality cannot be separated. So anytime you hear people talking about just about income inequality, my own opinion is, think also at least about income in access to law and governance. Think about people who have a business idea in Zimbabwe, but they don't have $30,000 to spend to build a shop, and so they're having to spend their lives in the black market, and the way in which that monopoly, this monopoly in law, systematically robs them of better economic opportunity. I guess with that, I'm sure there's all kinds of questions, and I'm happy to hear any kind of disagreement or criticism or whatever. So thank you.
incentive for like Robert Mugabe, president of Zimbabwe, if he's wise to the fact that you guys are developing these cities and that a lot of people from his country are going to go to these cities, why would he allow you guys to develop cities?
Well, first I want to say is that I'm not a city developer. We're just sort of, we're a nonprofit and all that, and I sort of have to make that clear. I don't stand to gain any money or anything from doing this. But the incentive he faces is many-fold, actually. First is sort of funny, but it's actually been quite consistent with people. Is that a lot of these guys are, maybe Robert Mugabe is an exception, but a lot of these guys are not really that bad of people. A lot of times they're confused. They know the way the game is played, but they're not total monsters. And sometimes they're genuinely motivated to do good in their country. The other thing is, even if they're not sort of altruistic about it, they want to leave their mark on history. And so, it becomes the Robert Mugabe International Center for Entrepreneurship or something like that. And a lot of people have been quite interested in, politicians I mean, in the payoff to them almost just being ego, in a way. The other reality is the way we've seen the reform structure now is the zones do pay. They pay to the federal government. It's not like, oh, you just have this mini state and it just has no ties to the federal government or anything. What they've done is they cap the tax rate. So let's say the overall tax rate could only be as high as 12%. But 3% of any revenue collected in the zone has to go to the federal government. So in that way, a lot of places that are really in dire straits economically could actually use it to finance their governments better. And that might actually have benefits, not necessarily, but in places like in Guatemala and Honduras, the drug cartels have budgets that are bigger than the police and the military sometimes. And I mean, they have submarines, it's totally crazy. And they, so you're trying to fight this battle with these drug cartels that are more powerful than the states. And so states are thinking, how can we raise money to do this? And we don't have to go on some big thing about the war on drugs or whether it's good or whatever, but I'm simply saying that that's a strong incentive from the point of a state actor for why you might do this. The other, it's prestige, it's incentive, and there's also sort of realpolitik, which is think about what happened in Tunisia, right? This was millions of people in the streets burning everything down and demanding the head of the ruler, and politicians don't want to be in a position like that. So sometimes politicians will concede things based on their own self-interest and in the preservation of their own power. And that's not always a good thing, but there are times when they may make a concession that's legitimately good for the general population, for the poor, based on the idea that I don't want to end up with unrest and a revolution or some coup or something like this.
How do you envision these cities interacting with the international community, for instance, international trade? Because I could see a problem where a country like Zimbabwe, which has severe restrictions on trade coming into the country, well, if the city is an open gateway point for the international community to get their goods into Zimbabwe, that could be seen as a strong incentive for not promoting this idea.
Yeah, I think in theory that's true, but in practice it's not. The reason is because that's actually a problem that was solved a really long time ago. There are, this idea really it's really a refinement of an idea that's been around for a very long time. Maybe some of you have heard about free zones, economic processing zones, special economic zones, special development zones. There's like every kind of acronym in the world to describe these things, but especially export processing zones, these are places that are explicitly designed for international trade. It's like the whole country has these horrible restrictions, and then there's a little dot that has essentially free trade, or they're embedded in an international free trade agreement. So, for example, you could imagine a NAFTA zone based on the North American Free Trade Agreement. So countries already do things very similar to this, which is, I think, another argument in its favor, that it's not this total revolution in thinking about stuff. It's just a refinement. Whereas those zones are focused on concessions in regulatory and fiscal policy, tax breaks, international trade, stuff like that. These zones are focused on all of that with one added element, which is the overall arbitration commercial law aspect of. So in that sense, it opens it up more broadly than rather than just like factories and international shippers that want to benefit from free trade. If you can open up commercial law, you actually open it up to the broader populace. And one more thing on that is there's a thing in Dubai called the DIFC, the Dubai International Financial Center. It's 100 acres, very, very small, and it's British common law in the middle of Dubai. And Dubai runs Sharia law. It's not very good for finance. It's not very good probably for all kinds of things, but it's really bad for finance. So they hired British common law judges and put it on 100 acres. What happened is, in the first 10 years of the existence of the Dubai International Financial Center, it attracted more foreign investment than all of sub-Saharan Africa combined in several decades. And that's in 100 acres. And all it was a proof of the hypothesis that commercial law matters. Another interesting aspect of this is that it began mostly as a financial center with banks, right? So they made all these financial laws, and they made it easy for banks to come and pour in investment there. And then they decided, you know, there's a lot of people from small and medium-sized businesses that also would take advantage of this. And they actually opened up British common law to small and medium-sized businesses, and there were thousands of people. And now they have a waiting list that goes on for months because they can't handle the load of people that are small and medium-sized businesses that are trying to opt into this alternative system. So from my perspective, that's an early stage verification of the idea that giving people this ability to exit in commercial law, there's a lot of demand, you know, there's a lot of demand, and the DIFC has done this.
So, but like when you're talking, you know, about like protecting interests within the country so they don't get subverted, I mean, there's a reason why some of these countries don't have free trade zones is because they want to keep those trade restrictions. A country that would be ideal for the free city, like the United States, send goods through the free city, and then the city could then disperse those goods and sell them to the general population of the country as a whole.
Yeah, that's right. And the reforms that have already occurred, and two countries have passed reforms that are explicitly aimed at this, or of a kind of similar idea, are they have a history of special economic zones and export processing zones, and they're also looking at it as a free trade, as a gateway for free trade internationally.
Just what you've said now, I wonder if you would consider it a reply to or anyway analogous to something else that reminded me of. I think it's actually in that blue book right there. There's an essay by this woman, I forget her name. They talk about like the special economic zone. In Africa, she complains like these aren't really freedom because like all these foreigners can come in and start importing and exporting, but we locals are still subject to all the same stuff. So it's like, I guess, is that what you're implicitly answering? That whereas I guess the special economic zones, you'll let foreign companies do all that they do. They don't let the locals start new businesses, and that's exactly, I guess, what you're correcting.
It is very much a response to that. Free zones, special economic zones, these things, they have a really mixed history. Some of them, I mean, the SEZs in China have probably been one, at least in the biggest anti-poverty campaign in human history. I mean, hundreds of millions of people have come out of poverty because of Hong Kong and because of the SEZs. And so that a lot of people overlook because they're so focused on other stuff, right? But there are free zones and there are export processing zones that are basically cronyist arrangements. So it'll be some dude who's really well connected in the government who really doesn't want to pay taxes or doesn't want to abide by whatever regulation XYZ, gets a special zone made for him. And it becomes at a competitive advantage, right? And that's a totally legitimate criticism. It's a major risk. It's something that you want to avoid. And I think really how you avoid that is open access into the commercial law, which is what you mentioned. Because if it's just about, oh, you get a tax break or something like this, it sort of lends itself to special interest politics. But if it's, look, anyone who can walk up in here and can fill out the paperwork, which is easy to do and doesn't cost a lot of money to start a business, can do this, it's much less likely to become a special interest project like some of these SEZs.
What type of opposition does startup cities face, like in Honduras and Guatemala City? Like,
it's various kinds. It's one of the strongest opposition to some of the reforms that have gone on in Honduras are from highly conservative businessmen. And I think the explanation is pretty clear, which is that many of these people are the people who benefit from the relatively closed-off nature of the Honduran government, and so they're not looking to lose their money, their monopoly. Another really other bizarre opposition that's occurred is via a sort of crony of Vladimir Putin in the Republic of Georgia. A presidential election was lost in Georgia, and the new president, the new government has become very hostile to some reforms that were done that were sort of in this kind of spirit, and they probably will destroy them and roll them back. And there wasn't really very much progress made, so it's very vulnerable at this point. But they're doing it, I think, for similar reasons, even though their rhetoric is more kind of the left in a certain sense. I think it's a similar kind of spirit, though. It's a corporatist kind of thing. And some of the other criticism, which I don't think is necessarily justified, but which has occurred, are concerns, legitimate concerns about land theft. Is that in the developing world, there's a lot of disputes about who owns land. Because sometimes there will be people who have lived on land, it's tribal land, it's been in their family for a really long time, stuff like this, and they don't want to give it up. And big landlords will sometimes use violence, just take land from people. And I mean, it's not the cause is not this. I mean, that's been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. But the concern is that if you go and you just start dropping these things in all these places, that you'll start creating, you'll go and you'll threaten someone's legitimate land claim. I think it's actually a beauty of this idea is that you could put it on a totally uninhabited land where, in a place like, a lot of developing countries have just, millions and millions of square acres of totally uninhabited land that it would not harm anyone for it to become economically developed. That's been the main criticism. I'm trying to think. The other main one are people who are generally hostile to markets. It's actually quite sad. There was a group in Honduras, mostly foreigners, like white foreigners, who are using the Honduran people and people from Honduras as poster childs for their own particular political beliefs. Many Hondurans are very much in favor of this kind of thing, and many people in Georgia were, and many people in other countries are very excited about it because they know it could do good in their country. But a lot of Americans are actually a big part of the problem. They've gone around the world, they have a very closed mentality, and they don't seem to think that other countries want to enjoy the kind of easy economic freedoms that America has. So they oppose people from benefiting from the very things that they as Americans have benefited from. So that's been the main criticism. Yeah.
Are they tending to do that from anti-colonial perspective, or
yes.
What's the interpretation?
Yes, the legacy of colonialism in so many countries is so terrible, and in Central America it's especially terrible. And their concern very much is, of course, that this could become a front for, say, a really rich foreign investor to come down and build some big enclave for him and his harem and his 5 buddies and whatever else he might want. And Honduras in particular was very smart about that because, I mean, I don't want that to happen. People involved in the sort of movement for startup cities don't want that to happen. It's totally at odds with what our motivations are. But it is a legitimate risk and concern that people have. So what they did was they structured the reform in a way that I think it's 90 or 95% of all the jobs in the zone must go to Honduran citizens. And I think that's a perfectly fine policy idea because it means that what you don't have are what's happened a little bit in Africa, where for instance, there'll be an infrastructure project in Africa built by the Chinese, and they'll bring in all Chinese labor to build the whole thing. And all the Africans are thinking, so I get some road, and the government's paying you to build this road, none of us get any jobs, you're not doing a good job on the road, and this is sort of what a lot of people will say is that the new face of colonialism is via private investment, via foreign investment. The other thing is that this is it's very much a creature of the Honduran federal government. I mean, it's right in the reforms. I think the same was true in Georgia, and certainly in any future countries that would want to do this. They have very strict human rights protections built into it. They have very, very clear delineation of powers. It's not just like, okay, well here, go invest some money and like build whatever you want. It's a very clear-cut reform that's going on. So I'm not really. I think some of the charges of colonialism are rhetoric and they're overstated. But I do think obviously you want to be on guard against it just becoming to the benefit of foreigners rather than the benefit of the host country.
Are any of these places also incorporating any non-local forms of civil law that are different? Or is it pretty
basically, criminal law in the reforms that have passed stays with the national government. I mean, even just if you think about it, like convincing someone to be like, oh, we're going to try criminals in this totally different way than you, it's just not something people are interested in. I don't even feel necessarily that comfortable with it right on the face of it, right? It's a very visceral kind of thing. And so, no, criminal law, that kind of stuff is all within the normal Honduran legal system, or within whatever national legal system you use. It's commercial law, you know, maybe family law, labor law, international trade law, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Professor Walter Block, and I wanted to offer an announcement and then make a substantive comment. The economics department offers 2 extracurricular activities. This is one of them. The other is held on Friday afternoons at 3:30, where we go over Rothbard's book this semester. So if anyone is interested, just email me, wblock, WBLOCK, @loyola.edu, and I'll give you more information about that. The substantive comments I had, I was thinking of quasi-free enterprise zones, and they're really all over the place. Like there's this factory between North Korea and South Korea, where North Koreans work in it and South Korean capital is used for it. You could look upon the entire state of Washington and Colorado as a free enterprise zone just for marijuana. And all of the Indian tribal lands where they allow gambling and they don't allow gambling anywhere else, you could look upon them as free enterprise zones just of gambling. You could perhaps look at Ciskei in South Africa in that way, and even the countries of Monaco and Liechtenstein and maybe Switzerland in Europe. You could even look upon the U.S. in 1776 in that way. We were a little dot compared to Great Britain. They could have kicked our butt, but they were busy with other things, and then the French came along and helped us a little bit. But if they had focused on us, they would have won that war, but they were just so busy with everything else, and they sort of looked upon us as like a gnat or something. So there are many, many examples of these free enterprise zones. Of course, the best one is the Hong Kong, which, you know, there was this movie, The Mouse That Roared, where this little country beat the U.S. in a war. It's sort of like Hong Kong beat China. I wanted to ask you about Detroit and the Free State Project as possible examples, but I think I disagree with you slightly on this idea that if like a bunch of Chinese come into some place and they only hire Chinese, well, I mean, maybe this law of you must hire some of the domestics is good to get the thing going, but ideally, you know, if they buy land and don't hire other people, well, still it helps. I don't see why it would be imperialist. It just seems like private property. But I'd be interested in your comment on that, plus the Free State Project in Detroit.
On the last point, I said that purely in the sense of people people are still spooked by the specter of colonialism, and if these kinds of opportunities could be given to all of Hondurans, and it would, I guess, in a sort of ultimate sense, right, maybe be at the expense of Chinese laborers, in the ultimate efficiency sense, right? Because let's say the comparative advantage is to have Chinese laborers come in and build everything, right? And that might be one argument you can make from economics. If it means that there are these inefficiencies to allow for this kind of thing to get off the ground and occur in the grander sense, I think it's totally worth it. I also think that the rewards, that the thing is, the Chinese immigrants to a zone here, right, in Zimbabwe, let's say, are not going to become people who are interested in the continued success of the reforms, because probably they're not going to become citizens of Zimbabwe. They're not going to necessarily go and assimilate to the rest of the whole country. So what you want to do, I think, for the longer term success of the reform is you want to be essentially creating interest groups, not in the sense of creating lobbying special interests, but in the sense you want to create people whose interest is the general interest of the country, and people who are motivated to defend these kinds of things from potential political attacks. I think if you have a huge proportion of the population getting their jobs there, that matters a lot. And in fact, there were in Honduras actually, despite the back and forth between many different kinds of presidencies of very disparate kinds of political and economic philosophies, they don't touch their free zones. They don't touch their free zones because they know if they go and they screw them up, they're going to have 100,000 really angry workers in the middle of the capital. So I think ideally to sustain it from political predation, it's not a bad idea. Although I agree with you on the grounds of economics that in a perfect world, in the ultimate sense, people should be perfectly free to go to any part of the world and take a job and live a happy life, and that would be great, I agree.
There is a domestic analogy in New York City. There were a lot of Koreans that had grocery stores in Harlem. There was a lot of resentment in the black community that the Korean groceries didn't hire black people to work in them, they just hired Korean people. So politically it was probably not viable, but it was certainly not imperialism or anything like that.
Sure. On the idea of a Free State Project and Detroit, Free State Project is a whole bunch of people that are trying to move to New Hampshire, and sort of, if you get enough people there, you can form a big voting bloc and you can vote whatever policies you want into the state legislature. It's an interesting idea, and they're using states in the sort of way that you might say you might use startup cities, in the sense that these are semi-autonomous jurisdictions, right, between states. New Orleans is very different than Nevada or something, right? So I would, if anyone's interested more broadly in that, there's this idea called competitive governance. Basically, if you think of governments as economic units, as competing with one another. For instance, Indian tribes and reservations, they create a comparative advantage for themselves by harnessing their autonomy to allow gambling and stuff. And they almost have like a sovereignty-based business model, so something like this. But this is a very interesting idea.
Zach, we're about out of time, but I'd like you to comment on the award that you won in 2011, and maybe share with the students that opportunity for entering the essay contest, whose deadline is September 2nd.
But there's an essay contest called the Carl Menger Essay Contest. It's an essay contest for the study of Austrian economics. I'm sure Dan has talked to you about this. If he hasn't, he ought to. And he will, I'm sure. It's put on by an organization called the Southern Economics Association, and it's a great contest to enter if you have an idea that sort of fits within the umbrella of the kinds of things that they're looking for. Things like ideas in political economy and development, this kind of stuff would work really well. You get money, you get to go to the conference, and they give you a nice award and a nice dinner, and it's great. And it's the people who judge it are wonderful people, and I'm really glad that I did it, and I'm pretty sure that the deadline is not too far away. So
September 2nd.
Okay, yeah. So if you have a paper, you ought to consider entering it because it's really worthwhile. It's really worthwhile and great for grad school apps and this kind of stuff. You're looking to do that.
It's only open to undergraduates, right?
Yes.
Thank you, Zach.